In the middle of the night, high above the Atlantic Ocean, an Airbus A330 carrying 306 people suddenly faced the unthinkable. Its fuel tanks ran dry. The cabin lights blinked out, oxygen masks tumbled from the ceiling, and the thunder of the engines gave way to an unsettling silence. In total darkness, the massive jet began gliding helplessly toward the sea below. The crew was stunned. The pilots fought to stretch every bit of altitude into distance, trying to guide the powerless plane as far as possible. Flight attendants braced passengers for a potential ocean landing, a scenario that usually leaves little chance of survival. It was a nightmare unfolding in real time. And yet, incredibly, this catastrophe should never have come so close to happening. While many accounts highlight the technical faults behind this disaster, that only tells part of the story. At its core, this incident is just as much about human behavior, how people respond under stress, how decisions are made when information is unclear. This is the dramatic account of Air Transat Flight 200. On the evening of August 23, 2001, 293 passengers and 13 crew members boarded an Airbus A330 at Toronto's Pearson International Airport. Their destination, Lisbon, Portugal, a flight scheduled to last about 7 hours. Most were vacationers excited to soak up the Portuguese sun, while others were nationals returning home. None could have imagined that a hidden flaw inside one of the engines would threaten their lives halfway across the ocean. By all appearances, nothing seemed amiss. The Airbus A330 was among the most advanced airliners in the world. Its computerized systems drew on hundreds of sensors, constantly feeding data to the pilots. Since its debut 7 years earlier, the aircraft had built a strong reputation for reliability and safety. This particular jet was only 2 years old. At the controls sat Captain Robert Pitch, a 48-year-old pilot with more than 16,000 hours of flying time in his logbook. His career had taken him through many types of aircraft, from land planes to seaplanes in Canada's rugged north. But his background was unconventional. He had once served prison time for smuggling drugs into the U.S. in a small aircraft. Despite that past, he was now an experienced and trusted airline captain. That night, he was paired with First Officer Dirk de Jager, 28 years old, with about 5,000 total flying hours, 400 of which were on the Airbus A330, though younger. He too had proven himself capable, with solid training and a clean record at Air Transat. With 48 tons of fuel on board, Flight 236 pushed back from the gate around 9 p.m. Toronto time. The plan was straightforward: climb eastbound to 39,000 feet, cruise through the night, and touch down in Lisbon by morning. For the first several hours, everything was calm. Passengers settled into their seats, many drifting off to sleep. Flight attendants carried out routine checks. In the cockpit, the pilots managed standard cruise duties, logging positions for air traffic control, verifying fuel against the flight plan, and scanning instruments. It was business as usual. But around 5 a.m. GMT, roughly halfway across the Atlantic, the aircraft's computers displayed puzzling warnings about the right side engine. Number 2. Readouts showed high oil pressure, low oil quantity, and unusually low oil temperature. The crew had never seen this particular combination before. Normally, oil temperatures climb during flight. They don't drop. Captain Pitch and First Officer de Jager turned to their manuals, searching for answers. Nothing matched the symptoms. With no guidance from the books, they radioed Air Transat's maintenance center in Quebec, relaying the odd engine readings. The dispatcher promised to investigate further and call back. Meanwhile, the crew kept a close watch on the instruments. In the cabin, however, nothing seemed wrong. Passengers remained unaware of the drama building outside, many still fast asleep. While the A330 pressed on into the dark Atlantic night, roughly half an hour later, just past 5:30 a.m. GMT, the crew faced their next surprise. A warning message flashed on the ECAM, the central display in the cockpit, alerting them to a fuel imbalance between the left and right wing tanks. While unusual, such an imbalance wasn't normally a dire problem. The standard fix was straightforward: open the crossfeed valve so fuel from one side could flow into the other. The pilots did exactly that, allowing fuel from the left wing to feed the right. But barely 10 minutes after adjusting the system, the fuel display showed something far more troubling. The total fuel on board had dipped below the minimum required to reach Lisbon. Suddenly, the situation was no longer routine. At that point, the aircraft was still halfway across the Atlantic, far from Europe. Their only realistic option was to divert to the Azores, a remote Portuguese island chain scattered in the middle of the ocean. They informed Santa Maria Air Traffic Control of their plan and set a course for Liges Airport on Terceira Island. Fuel levels, however, were falling alarmingly fast. Only 7 tons remained, about 6% of the A330's total capacity. Worse, the readings suggested the plane was losing nearly a ton every 5 minutes. If accurate, this pointed to a massive leak. Yet the crew struggled to accept that conclusion. Why? For one thing, there had been no obvious trigger, no loud bang, no turbulence, no lightning strike. The first half of the flight had been completely normal. On top of that, flight attendants peered out the windows and saw no streams of liquid trailing behind the engines or wings. And above all, the sheer scale of the apparent loss seemed almost impossible. How could the aircraft have gone from normal fuel consumption to such catastrophic depletion in such a short span? Convinced the readings must be wrong, the pilots leaned toward a different explanation: faulty sensors. Fuel leaks in commercial jets are exceptionally rare, and neither of the pilots had ever been formally trained to recognize one. Though a checklist for a suspected fuel leak existed, it wasn't something they had rehearsed. Complicating matters further, they had already dismissed earlier odd readings from the engine oil system as likely sensor errors. On a highly complex aircraft like the A330, bad data was not unheard of. So it seemed logical to lump these anomalies together. The tragic reality was that both sets of warnings, oil and fuel, were indeed connected. Deep inside engine number 2, a hydraulic line had been vibrating against a fuel pipe until it wore through. Once the pipe ruptured, fuel began gushing into the engine bay and venting overboard at a terrifying rate. Here, psychology played a pivotal role. The crew's mindset was shaped by confirmation bias. Once they assumed the data was faulty, they tended to filter new evidence in a way that reinforced that belief. Even as the imbalance grew and fuel totals plunged, they found reasons to explain it away rather than reset their assumptions. Under stress, and with heavy workloads managing checklists, coordinating with maintenance, briefing cabin crew, and handling air traffic communications, there was little mental space to challenge their initial judgment. Despite opening the crossfeed earlier, the imbalance persisted, and fuel continued disappearing at a prodigious pace. To compensate, the crew reversed the flow. They shut off the left pumps and used the right tank to feed both engines. Meanwhile, they again updated Air Transat's maintenance control center in Quebec, reporting fuel levels of just 4.8 tons, far less than the 17 tons expected at that stage. During the call, the numbers kept dropping. The crew debated whether to run the official fuel leak checklist, but Captain Pitch ultimately chose not to. The procedure required descending to 20,000 feet. He reasoned that if the problem truly was a leak, burning through the last of their fuel at a lower altitude would be catastrophic. Gliding from 39,000 feet at least gave them a fighting chance. This decision illustrates another psychological effect: framing bias. When faced with risk, people often weigh options in terms of potential gains and losses. To the captain, staying high represented a chance to maximize survival, while dropping lower felt like locking in disaster. And so, with the odds mounting against them, the crew pressed on toward the Azores. Captain Pitch faced a grim trade-off. One option was to descend immediately to 20,000 feet, which guaranteed a loss of altitude but bought time to run the official leak checklist. The other was to hold altitude at 39,000 feet, hoping to stretch the glide if the worst came to pass. Psychologists call this a framing effect. Given the choice between a definite setback and a gamble that might prove catastrophic, people often choose the gamble. That gamble ended abruptly at 6:13 a.m., when the right engine died. The captain shoved the remaining throttle forward and began a descent. The A330 could still fly with one engine, but not at its cruising altitude. The first officer quickly reported to air traffic control. They had lost an engine and were descending. By then, less than 600 kilograms of fuel remained, barely enough for minutes of flight, and the Azores were still 240 kilometers away. For the first time, the gravity of the situation was undeniable. The crew declared an emergency. 13 minutes later, disaster compounded. The second engine flamed out. Suddenly, one of the most advanced passenger aircraft in the world was reduced to an enormous glider. With both engines silent, the electrical systems cut out. A small backup turbine, called the ram air turbine, dropped from the belly of the plane, spinning in the airstream to provide a trickle of power just enough to run basic instruments and minimal hydraulics. The captain's mission now was singular: glide as far as humanly possible toward Liges Airport. Behind him, 293 passengers sat in pitch darkness, the cabin eerily quiet. Flight attendants prepared them for the possibility of ditching into the ocean, an almost certain death sentence in rough Atlantic swells. At night, with little chance of survival after impact or in freezing waters. For Pitch, there was no real choice left. If he couldn't stretch the glide to the island, everyone would be lost. The A330 dropped at 2,000 feet per minute. At 30,000 feet, that gave them about 15 minutes before meeting the ocean. Oxygen masks fell from the ceiling as the cabin depressurized, and passengers scrambled to put them on. In the cockpit, the pilots donned their own masks and fought to keep the aircraft stable. Though Pitch had practiced engine-out landings in smaller planes, nothing in his past compared to gliding a 180-ton airliner in darkness, with partial controls, toward a tiny island runway. The situation was made worse by the systems that no longer worked. 2 of the 3 hydraulic lines were gone, making the tailplane harder to control. Wing spoilers were mostly inoperative. Nose wheel steering and engine reversers were lost. meaning that even if the plane reached the runway, it would be nearly impossible to steer or stop normally. Elijah's controllers blinked the runway lights on and off, guiding the powerless jet toward the island like a beacon in the void. Pitch carefully held the glide between stall speed and the critical minimum needed to keep the ram air turbine generating power. Too slow, and the electrics would fail. Too fast, and the landing gear wouldn't deploy. Still, a new problem arose. By conserving altitude, the captain had stayed too high. 8 miles from the runway, the aircraft was still at 13,000 feet, about 4 times the normal height for that stage of approach. With no engines, descending steeply risked uncontrollable speed. Pitch improvised. He banked the A330 into a wide 360-degree turn to shed height, unnervingly pointing the nose away from the runway for part of the maneuver. The first officer extended the landing gear and slats to help drag the plane down, buying extra lift at lower speeds. When the turn ended, they were closer, but still too high. With no chance for another full circuit, Pitch resorted to sharp S-turns, zigzagging to burn off altitude while lining up for final approach. Below, fire trucks and ambulances lined the runway, ready for the impact of a fully loaded wide-body jet arriving without power. On final, there was no margin left. The approach was to fast around 200 knots instead of the usual 145 because without flaps they couldn't T-slow further. The first officer called out airspeeds and altitudes as the runway surged closer. There would be no go-around, no second attempt. The jet slammed into the runway with brutal force. 8 of the 12 tires blew instantly. The plane bounced, crashed back down, and began skidding. With no reversers, no spoilers, and no anti-skid system, the brakes locked and the wheels screeched down to their rims. Sparks flew as the jet barreled forward. Finally, after sliding nearly the length of the strip, the crippled A330 ground to a halt. Miraculously, all 306 souls on board were alive. The captain ordered an immediate evacuation. Within 90 seconds, passengers escaped down slides as fire crews rushed in to douse flames that had broken out in the left landing gear. Initially, the crew were hailed as heroes. They had pulled off the longest powerless glide ever achieved by a passenger aircraft, saving every life on board. Yet within days, investigators began asking difficult questions. How had an advanced jet run out of fuel in the middle of the Atlantic? Why had the warnings been dismissed? And why had the instruments, which had told the truth all along, not been trusted? The investigation revealed that fuel was depleting at an abnormally rapid rate. Analysts later determined that if the flight crew had performed any of the designated fuel leak procedures when they first diverted toward Elijah's, whether the checklist for an engine fuel leak, a wing fuel leak, or even the general fuel leak not located procedure, the aircraft would have touched down in the Azores with a safe reserve of at least 3.8 metric tons of fuel still on board. However, a mix of human factors prevented that from happening. Psychological influences, like confirmation bias and framing bias, led the crew to interpret the situation incorrectly. Added to this was the absence of a specific fuel loss warning in the Airbus A330's flight software, which further masked the real issue. Making matters worse, Air Transat had not provided its pilots with dedicated training on how to detect and respond to fuel leaks or apply the related checklists. The root cause of the problem was traced back to recent maintenance on engine number 2. A technician had inadvertently installed a component intended for a different aircraft type. This error caused a hydraulic line to press against a nearby fuel pipe. With vibration during flight, the hydraulic line eventually wore through the fuel tube, triggering a massive leak that bled away the aircraft's reserves. The final report concluded that the crew's failure to recognize the leak in time contributed to the fuel exhaustion. Yet, it also praised their extraordinary skill once the engines finally quit. One excerpt reads, "The captain's control of the aircraft during the powerless descent and landing was remarkable. Given the stressful conditions, the darkness, the lack of instrumentation, the limited pitch control, and the fact that he had never received training for such a scenario. The first officer provided strong and effective support throughout the glide and successful landing. In recognition of this, both Captain Robert Pitch and First Officer Dirk de Jager were honored the following year with the Airline Pilots Association's Superior Airmanship Award for executing the longest successful glide and dead-stick landing ever performed in a passenger airliner. That record still stands today. In the aftermath, Airbus upgraded its flight management computer to include a new warning system that alerts crews to unusually high fuel loss rates, indicating a possible leak. Air Transat also revised its training programs, adding more instruction on long-range operations, fuel monitoring, and diversion protocols. Thanks to these improvements, the incredible glide of Air Transat, Flight 236, will likely remain unmatched. A sobering reminder of human error, but also a lasting testament to skill and resilience in the cockpit.